Every woman knows the sting of being overlooked, but Sarah Mitchell felt it deeper than most. At 25, she watched every eligible man in Cedar Falls choose someone else, leaving her with the bitter taste of rejection and the growing whispers of spinsterhood. When Jakob Stone, a rugged mountain man from the high country, offered marriage, Sarah saw it as her salvation from a life of loneliness. She packed her few belongings and followed him into the Colorado wilderness, grateful for any chance at love and family. What Sarah didn't know was that Jakob had already shared his bed with her two older sisters, Martha and Rebecca, who had vanished into these mountains years before. As Sarah settles into Jakob's remote cabin, she begins to notice familiar belongings and catches glimpses of women's clothing that isn't hers. The mountain holds secrets as dark as its winter nights, and Sarah is about to discover that some men collect wives the way others collect pelts. But what happened to Martha and Rebecca, and why does Jakob keep their rooms exactly as they left them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always been the forgotten daughter. While her older sisters Martha and Rebecca turned heads with their golden hair and easy laughter, Sarah possessed the kind of quiet beauty that men seemed to look right through. Her dark hair hung straight as winter wheat, and her grey eyes held depths that most folks in Cedar Falls found unsettling rather than alluring. At 25, she had watched from church pews and town socials as every suitable bachelor chose someone else, always someone younger, prettier, or blessed with a father who owned more than a failing dry goods store. The Mitchell family had once been prosperous, back when Sarah's grandfather ran the largest general store in 3 counties. But years of poor decisions and her father's drinking had whittled away their fortune until only the store remained, barely keeping them fed and housed. Martha had escaped first, marrying a traveling merchant when Sarah was 19. Rebecca followed 2 years later, though her departure had been more mysterious. She'd simply announced one morning that she was going to find Martha and never returned. Their parents, worn thin by disappointment and grief, rarely spoke of their missing daughters. Sarah's mother spent her days in a rocking chair by the window, staring at the mountain passes as if her girls might come riding home any moment. Her father buried himself deeper in his bottles, leaving Sarah to run the store and tend to customers who paid. Her little mind beyond collecting their supplies, it was on a particularly grey October morning that Jakob Stone first walked through the door of Mitchell's general store. Sarah noticed him immediately, not because he was handsome, though his weathered face held a rugged appeal, but because he looked at her. Really looked, as if she were the only person in the room worth seeing. Jakob stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a door frame and hands that spoke of hard work and harder winters. His dark hair showed streaks of silver at the temples, and deep lines around his blue eyes suggested a man who'd seen more than his share of mountain storms. He moved with the deliberate grace of someone accustomed to dangerous terrain, every step calculated and sure. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the rough music of the high country. "I've heard tell you're a woman of uncommon sense and rare beauty." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. No man had ever spoken to her with such directness, such apparent sincerity. She fumbled with the bolt of fabric she'd been measuring, suddenly aware of her worn dress and work-roughened hands. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, sir. I don't believe we've been introduced." Jakob removed his hat, revealing more silver threading through his hair. "Jakob Stone. I keep a place up in the high country, beyond Widow's Peak. Been watching this town for some time, and I've taken particular notice of you." The words sent an unexpected thrill through Sarah's chest. A man had been watching her, thinking of her, finding her worthy of attention. After years of being invisible, the sensation felt intoxicating. Over the following weeks, Jakob became a regular visitor to the store. He would arrive late in the afternoon when customers were scarce, bringing small gifts, wildflowers from impossible places, honey from bees that shouldn't have survived at such altitude, stones worn smooth by mountain streams. He told her stories of life in the high country, painting pictures of vast skies and pristine silence that made Sarah's chest ache with longing. "A woman like you doesn't belong in a place like this," he would say, gesturing at the dusty shelves and creaking floorboards. "You belong somewhere clean and new, somewhere you can breathe." Sarah found herself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that frightened her. She would spend extra time on her appearance on the days she expected him, pinning her hair more carefully and wearing her one good dress. When he spoke of his mountain home, she could almost smell the pine and feel the bite of clean air on her skin. The proposal came on a snowy November evening. Jakob had stayed late to help her close the store, and as she turned the key in the lock, he took her hands in his. His palms were warm despite the cold, calloused but gentle. "Sarah Mitchell, I'm not a man given to pretty speeches or flowery words, but I know quality when I see it, and you're the finest woman this valley has produced. I'm asking you to be my wife, to come up to the mountain and make a proper life with me." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was what she had dreamed of through all those lonely years. A man who wanted her, who saw her worth when others saw only plainness. The practical part of her mind whispered cautions about marrying a man she'd known only 2 months, about leaving the familiar safety of town for the unknown wilderness. But the desperate, hope-starved part of her soul drowned out those whispers with its joyful cries. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, Jakob, I'll marry you." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church where Sarah had sat alone through so many services. The ceremony was simple. Jakob had no family to invite, and Sarah's parents seemed more relieved than celebratory. The preacher, Reverend Walsh, seemed troubled by the haste of the union, but performed his duties with solemn dignity. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. As she spoke her vows, she noticed how Jakob's eyes never left her face, how his voice carried absolute certainty when he promised to love and protect her. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt chosen, wanted, treasured. After the ceremony, the few townspeople who had attended offered polite congratulations. But Sarah caught the worried glances they exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, pulled her aside as Jakob loaded their meager possessions into his wagon. "Child," the older woman said, her lined face creased with concern, "you don't know anything about this man, except what he's told you. Mountain folk keep to themselves for reasons, and not all those reasons are good ones." Sarah squeezed the woman's weathered hands. "I know he's kind to me, Mrs. Henderson. I know he sees something in me worth loving. That's more than I've ever had before." The journey to Jakob's home took most of the day, winding through terrain that grew progressively more wild and isolated. The wagon path eventually became little more than a deer trail, forcing them to walk the final 2 miles through snow that reached Sarah's knees. Just as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, they crested a ridge, and Jakob's homestead came into view. The cabin was larger than Sarah had expected, built of massive pine logs chinked with clay and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and yellow lamplight glowed welcomingly in the windows. A barn and several smaller outbuildings dotted the clearing, all showing signs of careful maintenance and prosperity. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, and she meant it. The isolation that should have frightened her instead felt like sanctuary, a place where she could finally belong, without the weight of other people's judgments and expectations. Jakob carried her over the threshold, his strength making her feel delicate and precious. The interior of the cabin was warm and comfortable, furnished with handmade pieces that showed skilled craftsmanship. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the air smelled of pine and leather and something else, something faintly floral that reminded Sarah of her mother's rose garden. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," Jakob said, setting her gently on her feet. Sarah turned in a slow circle, taking in the woven rugs, the well-stocked shelves, the comfortable chairs arranged near the fire. It was more home than she'd ever had, more than she'd dared hope for. But as her gaze swept the room, she noticed details that gave her pause. Women's touches were everywhere. Delicate curtains at the windows, pressed flowers in frames on the mantel, a sewing basket with half-finished embroidery sitting beside one of the chairs. "Jakob," she said carefully, "whose things are these?" Her new husband's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A shutter falling, a door closing. "Just things I picked up in town over the years. Thought they'd make the place more welcoming for a wife." The explanation was reasonable, even thoughtful, but something in his tone made Sarah's skin prickle with unease. She told herself she was being foolish, that her years of rejection had made her suspicious of good fortune. This was her wedding night, the beginning of the life she'd dreamed of. She wouldn't let unfounded fears spoil it. Jakob showed her through the rest of the cabin, the well-appointed kitchen, the root cellar stocked with enough supplies to last through the harshest winter, the bedroom, with its massive bed covered in quilts that looked distinctly feminine in their patterns and colors. Everything spoke of comfort and permanence, of a man who'd prepared carefully for a wife's arrival. As they settled by the fire with cups of hot coffee, Sarah allowed herself to relax into the reality of her new life. Jakob was attentive and gentle, asking about her comfort, sharing stories of the neighbors they would meet come spring. The isolation that had worried her parents felt like a blessing. Here, she could be simply Jakob's wife, not the plain Mitchell girl who'd been passed over by every eligible man in 3 counties. But as the evening wore on and the fire burned low, Sarah found her gaze drawn repeatedly to those feminine touches throughout the room. The sewing basket seemed to call to her, and when Jakob stepped outside to check on the animals, she couldn't resist lifting the lid. Inside, she found delicate work, handkerchiefs edged with intricate lace, pillowcases embroidered with tiny flowers, a baby's gown half-finished in the softest white cotton. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the tiny garment. Who had been making clothes for a child that would never come? The work was recent, the thread still bright, the fabric uncreased by age. Someone had sat in this very chair perhaps just weeks ago, dreaming of a baby while creating these beautiful, hopeful things. Find something interesting? Sarah spun around to find Jakob standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. She fumbled to replace the baby gown, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have looked through your things." "Our things," Jakob corrected, moving closer. "Everything here belongs to you now, Sarah. Everything." But his voice carried an odd weight, and Sarah noticed he didn't answer her unspoken question about the baby clothes. Instead, he took the sewing basket from her hands and set it aside, his movements deliberate and final. "Come to bed, wife," he said softly. "Tomorrow, I'll show you the rest of your new home." As Sarah followed Jakob to their bedroom, she tried to shake off the growing sense that she had walked into a story already in progress, that the beautiful touches throughout the cabin weren't preparations for her arrival, but remnants of someone else's life. The thought followed her into the darkness, where Jakob's gentle hands and whispered words of love couldn't quite chase away the feeling that she was sleeping in another woman's bed, wearing another woman's life like an ill-fitting dress. Outside the cabin, the mountain wind howled through the pines, carrying with it the promise of winter and secrets that lay buried beneath the snow. Sarah's first week as Mrs. Stone passed in a dreamlike haze of domestic contentment. Jakob proved to be an attentive husband, bringing her coffee each morning and sharing stories of the mountain wildlife over dinner. Yet the feminine touches throughout the cabin continued to nag at her consciousness like a splinter beneath the skin. It was while cleaning the bedroom that Sarah made her first disturbing discovery. Jakob had ridden down to the lower pasture to check his small herd of cattle, leaving her alone for the first time since their arrival. She decided to organize the dresser drawers, wanting to make space for her few belongings alongside Jakob's practical clothing. The top drawer stuck when she tried to open it, warped by mountain moisture and age. When it finally yielded with a sharp crack, Sarah found herself staring at contents that made her blood turn to ice water. Nestled among Jakob's handkerchiefs and collar studs was a delicate blue hair ribbon, the exact shade Rebecca had always favored, made of silk that matched the dress their mother had sewn for Rebecca's 16th birthday. Sarah's hands shook as she lifted the ribbon. The silk was still supple, recently handled, and caught in its folds was a single strand of golden hair. Rebecca's hair, unmistakably. Sarah sank onto the bed, her mind reeling. How had her sister's ribbon come to be in Jakob's most private drawer? The rational part of her mind offered weak explanations. Perhaps Jakob had found the ribbon somewhere. Perhaps it wasn't even Rebecca's. But deep in her heart, Sarah knew better. This wasn't coincidence. This was proof that her sister had been in this very room, had been intimate enough with Jakob to leave such a personal item behind. When Jakob returned that evening, Sarah waited until after supper to confront him. She placed the ribbon on the table between them, her heart hammering so hard she feared he could hear it. "I found this today," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "It belonged to my sister, Rebecca." Jakob's face showed no surprise, only a mild interest as he picked up the ribbon and examined it. "Pretty thing. Where did you find it?" "In your dresser drawer, Jakob, the one where you keep your most personal belongings." For a long moment, Jakob said nothing. He wound the ribbon around his finger, and Sarah noticed his hands, strong, capable hands that could have easily overpowered a young woman. When he finally looked up, his blue eyes held a coldness she'd never seen before. "Your sister was a beautiful woman," he said simply. "We knew each other." "Knew each other how?" Sarah's voice rose, despite her efforts to remain calm. "She disappeared 3 years ago, Jakob. She came looking for Martha and never returned home." "What happened to her?" Jakob stood and moved to the fireplace, still holding the ribbon. "Rebecca was headstrong, independent. She thought she could survive up here on her own." He tossed the ribbon into the flames, where it curled and vanished in a flash of blue fire. "The mountains don't care about independence. Are you saying she's dead?" "I'm saying the high country claims what it wants. Sometimes that's animals. Sometimes it's people who venture too far from safety." Sarah felt sick. The casual way Jakob dismissed her sister's fate, the destruction of the only evidence she'd found, it all pointed to something far darker than a tragic accident. But she was alone with him, miles from help, completely at his mercy. She forced herself to nod, to accept his explanation even as every instinct screamed warnings. That night, Sarah lay awake beside her sleeping husband, studying his profile in the moonlight. The man who had courted her so gently, who had promised to cherish and protect her, might have killed both her sisters. The thought was so monstrous she could barely hold it in her mind, yet the evidence was mounting. The next morning, while Jakob tended to his animals, Sarah began a systematic search of the cabin. In the kitchen, behind sacks of flour and beans, she found a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a hiding place that made her gasp with recognition. Martha's diary, the leather-bound book their father had given her for her 18th birthday. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. Martha's familiar handwriting filled the pages, chronicling her life as Jakob's wife. The early entries were full of happiness and hope, describing a man who seemed devoted and loving. But as Sarah read on, the tone began to change. March 15th. Jakob was strange today when I mentioned visiting town. He says the weather is too dangerous, but I can see the pass is clear from the kitchen window. Sometimes I feel like a bird in a cage, even a golden one. March 22nd. Found women's clothing in the root cellar that isn't mine. When I asked Jakob about it, he grew angry. He said I was imagining things, but I know what I saw. A blue dress, the kind Rebecca always favored, April 3rd. Jakob watches me constantly now. I can't even step outside without him appearing at my side. When I suggested we visit my family for Easter, he forbade it absolutely. His eyes when he's angry. There's something wrong behind them. April 10th. I tried to leave today while Jakob was hunting. Made it halfway to the pass before he caught me. He was gentle when he brought me back, apologetic, but his grip left bruises on my arms. He says he loves me too much to let me go. I'm beginning to understand that love and possession might be the same thing to him. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Martha had supposedly left with her merchant husband. April 18th, Rebecca arrived today, looking for me. I was so happy to see her, but also terrified. I tried to warn her about Jakob, but she wouldn't listen. She thinks I'm being dramatic, that I've let isolation affect my judgment. Jakob was charming at dinner, told her stories and made her laugh. She's staying in the spare room tonight. I pray I'm wrong about my fears, but I've hidden this diary where he'll never find it. If something happens to me, I want someone to know the truth. Jakob Stone is not the man he pretends to be. Sarah's breath came in short gasps as she finished reading. Martha had tried to warn Rebecca, had sensed the danger, but it had been too late. Both her sisters had walked into Jakob's web, drawn by the same lonely desperation that had brought Sarah to this cursed place. She heard Jakob's boots on the porch and quickly returned the diary to its hiding place, arranging the flour sacks to conceal the loose board. By the time he entered the kitchen, she was at the stove, ladling porridge into bowls with hands that shook only slightly. "You're quiet this morning," Jakob observed, settling at the table. "Just thinking about my sisters," Sarah replied truthfully. "I miss them." "Of course you do." His voice held sympathy, but Sarah now heard the false note beneath it. "Family is precious. We should cherish the time we have with those we love." The words might have comforted her a week ago. Now they sounded like a threat. Sarah nodded and smiled, playing the role of the grateful wife, while her mind raced with plans. She couldn't let Jakob know what she'd discovered. Her sisters had made that mistake, and it had cost them their lives. As she watched Jakob eat the breakfast she'd prepared, Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she was living with a murderer. The man who shared her bed, who whispered words of love in the darkness, had almost certainly killed Martha and Rebecca. And if she wasn't very careful, very clever, she would be next. The mountains that had seemed like sanctuary now felt like a prison. The isolation that had promised freedom from judgment now meant there was no one to hear her scream. But unlike her sisters, Sarah had one advantage. She knew what Jakob was capable of. The question was whether that knowledge would be enough to keep her alive long enough to escape. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the peaks, and the wind began to howl with the promise of winter's return. Inside the warm cabin, Sarah Stone smiled at her husband and began to plan. Over the following days, Sarah forced herself to maintain the facade of a contented newlywed while secretly exploring every inch of Jakob's property. She waited for moments when he was occupied with chores, mending fences, chopping wood, tending to his small herd, to venture further from the cabin than she dared before. The homestead was larger than she'd initially realized, with outbuildings scattered across the clearing and paths leading into the dense pine forest. Behind the main cabin, she discovered a root cellar dug into the hillside, its heavy wooden door secured with an iron latch. When Jakob was safely occupied in the barn, Sarah lifted the latch and descended into the cool, earth-scented darkness. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with preserved vegetables, smoked meats, and mason jars filled with fruits and pickled goods. But it was the far corner that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Hanging from wooden pegs were dresses, not one or two, but nearly a dozen garments in various sizes and styles. She recognized Martha's green wool dress, the one she'd worn to church every Sunday. Rebecca's blue silk, the pride of her wardrobe, hung beside it like a ghost. But there were others too. A yellow calico that belonged to no one Sarah knew, a burgundy velvet that spoke of wealth and refinement, a simple brown homespun that might have belonged to a farmer's daughter. Each dress told the story of a woman who had come to this place and never left. Sarah's hands shook as she examined the garments. Some showed signs of violence, tears, stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Others appeared to have been removed carefully, lovingly preserved like trophies. She thought of Jakob's gentle hands, his soft-spoken manner, and felt bile rise in her throat. How many women had trusted him? How many had seen his smile as she had, believing they'd found salvation in his offer of marriage? A sound from outside, Jakob's voice calling to the cattle, sent her scrambling up the cellar steps. She carefully secured the latch and hurried back to the cabin, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might burst. She had to act normal, had to give no sign that she'd discovered his collection of horrors. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Jakob seemed more talkative than usual. He told her stories of his years in the mountains, painting himself as a man who'd chosen solitude to escape the corruption of civilization. But Sarah now heard different meanings in his words. "There's a purity up here," he said, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of townfolk. A man can live by his own code, follow his own nature without society's constraints. Doesn't it get lonely?" Sarah asked, testing the waters, Jakob's gaze fixed on her with unsettling intensity. "I've never been alone for long. The mountains have a way of bringing me what I need, when I need it. Beautiful things tend to find their way to me eventually." The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. She thought of Martha's diary entry about feeling like a caged bird, of Rebecca's disappearance, of all those dresses hanging in the root cellar. Jakob didn't just find women, he collected them. 2 days later, while Jakob was hunting in the high meadows, Sarah encountered her first neighbor. She was hanging laundry when an old man emerged from the tree line, leading a pack mule loaded with furs. His weathered face showed surprise at seeing her. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, removing a battered hat. Didn't know old Jakob had himself another wife. The word "another" hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm Sarah Stone. We were married last month." "Pete Garrison," the man introduced himself. "Got a trapline runs through this valley. Known Jakob for, must be going on 8 years now." His eyes, sharp despite his age, studied her with obvious concern. "You're the third Mrs. Stone I've met." Sarah's mouth went dry. "The third?" Pete glanced toward the cabin, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Pretty blonde gal named Martha, then another one looked just like her. Rebecca, I think her name was. Fine women, both of them. Shame what happened, or what did happen." The old trapper's expression grew guarded. "Jakob tell you they left him? Ran off with other men?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Pete spat into the dirt. "That's what he says. But I've been trapping these mountains for 30 years, miss. I know every pass, every trail, every place a person might go. Neither of them gals ever came down off this mountain." Before Sarah could respond, they heard Jakob's voice calling her name from the direction of the cabin. Pete's face went pale beneath his beard. "Don't tell him we talked," he whispered urgently. "Jakob don't like his wives speaking to other folks. The last time I tried to warn Martha about—" "Sarah!" Jakob's voice was closer now, carrying a sharp edge of authority. Pete backed toward his mule, fear evident in his movements. "I got to go. You be careful, Mrs. Stone. Real careful." He disappeared into the forest with surprising speed for such an old man, leaving Sarah standing alone with laundry fluttering around her like warning flags. When Jakob emerged from the trees, carrying a brace of rabbits, his eyes immediately swept the clearing. "Thought I heard voices?" he said casually. But Sarah caught the tension in his shoulders. "Just talking to myself," she replied with a forced smile. "Sometimes the silence gets to me." Jakob studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face for deception. Finally he nodded and held up the rabbits. "Fresh meat for dinner. Why don't you go inside and start preparing vegetables? I'll dress these and be right along." Sarah obeyed, but as she peeled potatoes in the kitchen, she watched through the window as Jakob examined the ground where she'd stood talking to Pete. His movements were methodical, professional, like a tracker reading sign. When he found the mule's hoofprints, his body went rigid. He spent several minutes studying the tracks before following them to where they disappeared into the forest. That night, Jakob was different. His usual gentleness seemed forced, and she caught him watching her with a calculating expression when he thought she wasn't looking. During dinner, he asked casual questions about her day, her activities, whether she'd noticed anything unusual. Each question felt like a test, and Sarah prayed her answers satisfied him. As they prepared for bed, Jakob opened the drawer where she'd found Rebecca's ribbon. His hands moved through the contents with practiced familiarity, and Sarah realized he was checking to see if anything had been disturbed. When his fingers found what he was looking for, a long-bladed hunting knife with a worn leather grip, he paused. "I'll be doing some tracking tomorrow," he said, running his thumb along the blade's edge. "There are wolves in the area. Can't have them threatening the livestock." But Sarah saw dried stains on the steel that looked nothing like animal blood. The knife was clean otherwise, cared for with the devotion of a craftsman for his favorite tool. She thought of Pete's frightened face, his warning about what happened to women who spoke to outsiders. "Maybe I could come with you," she suggested, testing his reaction. "I'd like to learn more about the mountain." Jakob's hand stilled on the knife. "The high country is dangerous for women. Too many ways to get hurt, too many places to fall and never be found. You'll stay here where it's safe." The finality in his voice brooked no argument. As Jakob slid the knife back into the drawer, Sarah understood with chilling clarity that she was looking at the weapon that had killed her sisters. The blade that had ended their hopes and dreams now lay just feet from where she would sleep. In the hands of the man who whispered words of love in her ear, she lay awake that night, listening to Jakob's steady breathing and planning her next moves. Pete had tried to warn Martha, and Sarah suspected that Confrontation had signed the old trapper's death warrant. She couldn't let the same thing happen again. But she also couldn't ignore the lifeline he'd offered. Someone else knew the truth about Jakob Stone. The question was whether Pete would live long enough to help her, or whether she'd already cost him his life by accepting his warning. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the pines, like the voices of all the women who'd trusted the wrong man, and Sarah pulled the quilts closer around her shoulders, knowing that warmth was an illusion in a house built on graves. Jakob left before dawn, his hunting knife secured at his belt and his rifle slung across his shoulder. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as he disappeared into the forest, following what she now realized were Pete's tracks from the day before. The old trapper's words echoed in her mind. "Don't tell him we talked." Once certain Jakob was gone, Sarah returned to the root cellar with Martha's diary. She needed to read every word, to understand exactly what her sisters had discovered and how they had died. Hidden among the preserved goods, she found Martha's family Bible, the one their grandmother had given her before she died. The leather binding was worn soft with handling, and pressed between its pages were wildflowers and a folded letter that made Sarah's heart stop. The letter was addressed to their parents, written in Martha's careful script, but never sent. Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the yellowed paper. "Dearest Mama and Papa, I pray this letter finds you well, though I fear you will never receive it. I've made a terrible mistake in marrying Jakob Stone, and I fear for my life. He is not the man he presented himself to be in town. There is a darkness in him that I failed to see until it was too late. I have found evidence that other women have lived in this cabin before me. Their belongings are hidden throughout the house, and Jakob becomes violent when I ask about them. He will not allow me to leave the mountain, and his eyes. There is something wrong behind his eyes when he looks at me now, as if I am not a person, but a possession. I have tried to escape twice, but he tracks me like a hunted animal and brings me back. He says he loves me too much to let me go, but this is not love. This is something sick and twisted. Yesterday, I found a woman's shoe buried behind the woodshed, and the leather was stained with what I fear was blood. Rebecca has written that she plans to visit in the spring. I must warn her somehow, must keep her from making the same mistake I have made. If something happens to me, please know that I loved you both, and I'm sorry for the worry I've caused. Tell Rebecca to stay away from this cursed place, no matter what lies Jakob might tell her. Your loving daughter, Martha P.S. I have hidden this letter and my diary where Jakob will never find them. If by some miracle someone else reads this, know that Jakob Stone is a murderer. The graves behind the cabin are not for animals. Sarah clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Martha had known the truth, had tried to warn Rebecca, but it hadn't been enough. Her poor sister had lived her final months in terror, trapped with a man who saw women as things to be collected and discarded. The mention of graves behind the cabin sent Sarah hurrying outside. She'd noticed the small fenced area during her first week, but had accepted Jakob's explanation that they were burial plots for beloved pets and livestock. Now, studying the carefully maintained markers with fresh eyes, she counted 13 wooden crosses arranged in neat rows, 13 women, each reduced to an unmarked grave in a killer's garden. One of the graves was fresher than the others, the earth still dark and soft despite the recent frosts. Sarah knelt beside it, touching the rough wooden cross, and whispered a prayer for whichever poor soul lay beneath. Had this been Martha's final resting place or Rebecca's? Were they buried side by side? Or had Jakob scattered his victims throughout the mountain to better hide his crimes? A sound from the forest made her freeze, voices carrying on the wind. Sarah ran back to the cabin and peered through the curtains to see Jakob emerging from the tree line. He wasn't alone. Behind him, stumbling and bloodied, came Pete Garrison. The old trapper's hands were bound behind his back, and a crude gag covered his mouth. Sarah's stomach lurched. Jakob had found Pete, and now he was bringing him back like a trophy. She watched in horror as Jakob forced the old man to his knees beside the chopping block, then disappeared into the barn. When he emerged, he carried a coil of rope and the same hunting knife she'd seen in his drawer. From her hiding place behind the curtains, Sarah witnessed the methodical way Jakob prepared for murder. He tested the rope's strength, checked the knife's edge, arranged his tools with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this many times before. Pete struggled against his bonds, his eyes wide with terror above the gag. But Jakob paid no more attention to his victim's distress than a butcher might to a pig squealing. Sarah realized she had to act. She couldn't save Pete. He was already as good as dead, but she might be able to learn something that would help her escape. Moving carefully through the cabin, she positioned herself at the bedroom window where she could hear their conversation. Jakob removed Pete's gag, but left his hands bound. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you, old man? Had to go filling my wife's head with stories. She deserves to know what kind of monster she married," Pete gasped, blood running from his split lip. "How many women have you killed, Stone? How many families are wondering what happened to their daughters?" "Enough to know what works and what doesn't." Jakob's voice was conversational, almost friendly. "You made the same mistake Martha did, thinking you could warn them, thinking you could help them escape. But there is no escape from this mountain. Not for them, not for you. The law will come looking for me eventually." Jakob laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "The law thinks you died in an avalanche 2 winters ago. Amazing how easy it is to make someone disappear up here. A torn coat, a little blood on some rocks, maybe a few bones scattered where the scavengers can find them. Nature covers the rest." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Jakob hadn't just killed Pete's women. He'd been murdering anyone who got too close to the truth. How long had this been going on? How many people had simply vanished into Jakob's mountain sanctuary? "Sarah seems different from the others," Pete said, clearly trying to buy time. "Stronger. She won't be as easy to break as Martha and Rebecca." "Every woman breaks eventually," Jakob replied, testing the rope in his hands. "Some just take longer than others. Martha lasted almost 6 months before she tried to run the final time. Rebecca barely made it 3 weeks. She was too much like her sister, too suspicious, too willing to believe the worst of people. And if Sarah tries to leave?" Jakob's smile was visible even from Sarah's vantage point. "Then she'll join her sisters in the garden behind the cabin. But I don't think it will come to that. Sarah is lonely, desperate for love. She'll convince herself that staying is better than dying, just like all the others did until they finally accepted their fate." Sarah watched in sick fascination as Jakob positioned the noose around Pete's neck. The old trapper closed his eyes and began mumbling what sounded like a prayer. With one smooth motion, Jakob threw the rope over a sturdy pine branch and began to pull. Sarah turned away before the end, pressing her hands over her ears to block out the sounds. When she finally looked again, Pete's body hung motionless from the tree, and Jakob was already digging a new grave in his garden of victims. The sight burned itself into Sarah's memory. Her husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect her, disposing of a human being with the same casual efficiency he showed when butchering livestock. This was what had happened to her sisters, to all the women whose dresses hung in the root cellar like a museum of the dead. As Jakob worked, whistling tunelessly while he dug, Sarah began to understand the true scope of her situation. She wasn't just trapped with a murderer, she was trapped with a predator who'd perfected his methods over years of practice. He knew exactly how to isolate his victims, how to break their spirits, how to make them believe that submission was survival. But Sarah had one advantage her sisters hadn't possessed. She knew what Jakob was from the beginning. Martha and Rebecca had discovered the truth too late, after they were already isolated and vulnerable. Sarah could use Jakob's expectation of gradual submission against him, could play the role of the increasingly compliant wife, while secretly preparing her escape. When Jakob finished his grisly work and headed toward the cabin, Sarah quickly returned to the kitchen and began preparing dinner. Her hands shook as she peeled vegetables, but she forced her expression into a mask of domestic contentment. She was stirring a pot of stew when Jakob entered, blood still caked under his fingernails. "Smells wonderful," he said, kissing her cheek as if he hadn't just murdered an innocent man. "Did you have a pleasant day?" "Quiet," Sarah replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "I did some cleaning and worked on mending your shirts." Jakob nodded approvingly. "A wife's work is never done. I'm glad you're settling into your role so well." As they sat down to dinner, Sarah watched her husband eat the meal she'd prepared, marveling at his ability to separate the different aspects of his life. To look at him now, no one would suspect he was anything other than a devoted husband enjoying his wife's cooking. But Sarah could see the blood under his nails, could smell the pine resin on his clothes from handling Pete's rope. "I saw some wolf tracks near the barn today," Jakob mentioned casually. "Big ones. I'll need to be more vigilant about protecting what's mine." The words sent a chill through Sarah. Was he talking about actual wolves? Or was this his way of warning her about the consequences of trying to run? She nodded and made appropriate sounds of concern, but inside, her mind was racing with plans. She now knew exactly what Jakob was capable of, had seen the evidence of his crimes with her own eyes. The question was whether she could survive long enough to escape, or whether she would end up as just another unmarked grave in his garden of the dead. One thing was certain, she wouldn't go quietly like her sisters had. If Jakob Stone wanted to add her to his collection, he was going to discover that some prey fights back. The morning after Pete's murder, Sarah waited until Jakob left to check his traplines before beginning her most dangerous investigation yet. She had to know for certain that her sisters were buried in that awful garden, had to see the proof with her own eyes before she could fully accept the horror of her situation. Armed with a small garden spade, Sarah made her way to the newest grave, the one with dark, recently turned earth that spoke of a fresh burial. The wooden cross bore no name, no dates, just crude knife marks that might have been meant to represent a person's initials. With shaking hands, Sarah began to dig. The mountain soil was hard, mixed with roots and stones that made her progress slow and painful. Her hands blistered within minutes, and her back ached from the awkward position, but she pressed on. She had to know. She had to be certain. 6 inches down, her spade struck something that wasn't earth or stone, something that gleamed silver in the morning light, catching and reflecting the sun like a mirror. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she carefully excavated the object, brushing away dirt and pine needles with trembling fingers. Rebecca's silver locket, the one their grandmother had given her on her 18th birthday. The one that held a tiny daguerreotype of their family taken before the troubles began. Sarah's own face stared back at her from the faded photograph, flanked by Martha and Rebecca, all 3 sisters smiling with the innocence of youth. The chain was broken, as if torn from Rebecca's neck in violence or struggle. Dark stains on the silver suggested it had been buried with its owner, a final connection to home and family that Jakob couldn't bring himself to steal. Sarah clutched the locket to her chest and wept for her sisters, for the lives cut short by a madman's obsession for the families who would never know what became of their daughters. But grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Sarah carefully refilled the grave, replacing the soil exactly as she'd found it. She tucked Rebecca's locket inside her dress, next to her heart, where it would serve as both memorial and motivation. Her sisters would be avenged, but first she had to survive. As she walked back toward the cabin, Sarah's mind catalogued every detail of the property with new eyes. The forest paths Jakob used for hunting, the location of his weapons, the schedule he kept for his various activities. If she was going to escape this mountain alive, she needed to know every advantage and disadvantage, every opportunity and threat. The barn drew her attention first. Jakob spent considerable time there each morning, tending to his small herd of cattle and the workhorses he used for heavy labor. But Sarah had never been inside, had always been discouraged from entering with vague comments about dangerous animals and sharp tools. With Jakob safely away checking traps, Sarah slipped through the barn's heavy wooden door and immediately understood why he kept it forbidden. This wasn't just a shelter for livestock, it was a workshop dedicated to death. Hanging from the rafters were coils of rope, some stained dark with what could only be blood. A workbench held knives of various sizes and shapes, all honed to razor sharpness. And along one wall, arranged with museum-like precision, were personal effects that told the stories of Jakob's victims. Jewelry boxes sat open, displaying rings, necklaces, and earrings that had once adorned living women. Photographs in cracked frames showed smiling faces, some familiar from wanted posters Sarah vaguely remembered seeing in town. Others completely unknown, but all sharing the common tragedy of having trusted the wrong man. A collection of letters tied with ribbon contained final words from daughters to parents, wives to husbands, all intercepted before they could be sent. At the center of this macabre display was a ledger bound in black leather. Sarah's hands shook as she opened it, revealing page after page of careful entries written in Jakob's precise script. Names, dates, descriptions of methods, even sketches showing where each body had been buried. It was a murderer's diary, a record of systematic killing that spanned more than a decade. The entries began in 1859 to November 3rd. First success. Mary Catherine Walsh, age 19, from Denver. Resisted longer than expected, but broke after 2 weeks of proper training. Disposed of December 1st after she attempted escape. Buried northeast section, marked with pine cross. Sarah's stomach churned as she read entry after entry, each one detailing the capture, subjugation, and eventual murder of young women. Jakob had been operating for 15 years, preying on the desperate and lonely, with promises of love and security. The ledger revealed the truth behind dozens of disappearances across Colorado Territory and beyond. Martha's entry was dated March of the previous year, March 12, 1869. Martha Rose Mitchell, age 23, Cedar Falls, exceptionally beautiful specimen. Initially compliant, but developed troublesome independence. Lasted 6 months before final disposal became necessary. Sister Rebecca arrived April 18th as predicted. 2-for-1 acquisition proves efficiency of targeting family groups. Rebecca's entry followed April 30th, 1869. Rebecca Ann Mitchell, age 21, Cedar Falls. Suspicious nature made breaking difficult. Disposed of May 2nd after failed escape attempt. Both Mitchell sisters buried in southeast section. Consider targeting final sister if opportunity arises. The final entry made Sarah's blood turn to ice. November 8th, 1870. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, age 25, Cedar Falls, last of the Mitchell line, desperate for marriage due to advanced age and plain appearance. Perfect candidate for long-term acquisition. Wedding, November 11th. Expect 6 to 8 months of useful service before disposal becomes necessary. Sarah stared at the words that spelled out her fate with clinical detachment. To Jakob, she wasn't a wife or even a human being. She was a specimen to be acquired, used, and eventually discarded, like all the others. The ledger predicted she would last 6 to 8 months, which meant Jakob expected to kill her sometime between May and July of the coming year. But the ledger also revealed something else. Jakob's growing confidence had made him careless. He documented everything, preserved evidence that could hang him if it ever fell into the right hands. The question was whether Sarah could get that evidence to the authorities before her predicted disposal date arrived. A sound from outside, Jakob's voice calling to his cattle, sent Sarah scrambling to replace the ledger and escape the barn. She made it back to the cabin with seconds to spare, her heart hammering as she threw herself into domestic activities that would explain her flushed appearance and rapid breathing. When Jakob entered the kitchen, he found her peeling apples for a pie, her movements perhaps a bit too energetic to be entirely natural. His sharp eyes studied her for a long moment, and Sarah forced herself to smile. "You're back early," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I was just starting dinner preparations." "The traps were empty today," Jakob replied, moving closer to examine her work. "Sometimes the mountain provides, sometimes it withholds its gifts. We must be patient and grateful for what we have." His hand settled on her shoulder, fingers pressing just hard enough to remind her of his strength. Sarah continued peeling apples, each precise curl of skin falling away like layers of her former innocence. She could feel Jakob's eyes on her, searching for signs of deception or discovery. "You seem energetic today," he observed. Almost excited about something. Sarah's knife paused for just a fraction of a second before resuming its steady rhythm. "I suppose I'm finally starting to feel at home here. The mountain is growing on me. Good. Some women never adjust to the isolation. They let loneliness and wild imaginings drive them to unfortunate decisions." The words carried layers of meaning that made Sarah's skin crawl. Jakob was probing, testing her mood and reactions. Had he noticed something amiss? Did he suspect she'd been in the barn? "I can't imagine wanting to leave," Sarah said, injecting warmth into her voice. "This is the first real home I've ever had." Jakob's grip on her shoulder relaxed slightly. "I'm pleased to hear that. A man needs to know his wife is content, that she won't be tempted by foolish notions of independence." That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Jakob seemed more talkative than usual. He told her stories of his early years on the mountain, painting himself as a man seeking solitude and peace. But Sarah now heard different meanings in every word, could see the careful construction of his false persona. "Have you ever been lonely up here?" she asked, playing the role of the interested wife. "Before you married Martha, I mean." Jakob's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Martha wasn't my first wife, Sarah. There were others before her, women who couldn't appreciate what I offered them. What happened to them? They chose to leave." Jakob's voice carried finality, but Sarah pressed on. "All of them? None of them stayed to build a life with you?" "Building a life requires commitment, Sarah, loyalty. Some women lack the strength of character necessary for mountain living. They drift away like snow in spring." The euphemism was almost poetic in its horror. Sarah nodded sympathetically, while her mind recoiled from the casual way Jakob dismissed multiple murders. How many wives had there been? How many women had trusted his gentle manner and found themselves trapped in this nightmare? "I hope I'm stronger than they were," Sarah said softly. Jakob leaned forward, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "I believe you are. You have a quality the others lacked. Acceptance of your place in the world. You understand that some of us are meant to give, while others are meant to receive." Sarah nodded as if this made perfect sense, but inside she raged at his twisted philosophy. Jakob had convinced himself that his victims were somehow lesser beings, that their deaths were natural consequences of their own weaknesses, rather than the actions of a monster who saw women as disposable objects. Later that night, as Jakob slept beside her, Sarah lay awake planning her escape. She couldn't simply run. Jakob was an expert tracker who knew every path off the mountain. She couldn't overpower him physically. He was twice her size and armed with multiple weapons. And she couldn't rely on outside help, since Jakob had systematically eliminated anyone who might pose a threat. But she had two advantages Jakob didn't know about. She knew the truth about his nature from the beginning, and she had access to evidence that could destroy him. The ledger in the barn was a detailed confession that would ensure Jakob faced justice for his crimes. If Sarah could somehow get that evidence to the authorities in town, she might be able to save not only herself, but future victims as well. The plan forming in her mind was dangerous, requiring perfect timing and nerves of steel. She would have to convince Jakob that she was completely broken and submissive, while secretly preparing for a single, desperate gambit that would either free her or result in her immediate death. As the wind howled through the pines outside their window, Sarah Mitchell Stone began the most important performance of her life, playing the role of a defeated woman while planning the destruction of the man who'd killed her sisters. Rebecca's locket pressed against her heart like a talisman, reminding her that she carried not just her own hopes for survival, but the weight of justice for all of Jakob's victims. The mountain had claimed many women over the years, but Sarah was determined to be the one who finally exposed its darkest secret to the light. Sarah's carefully orchestrated performance of submission began the next morning. She started small, asking Jakob's opinion on every domestic decision, deferring to his judgment even on matters she clearly understood better. When he suggested she rearrange the kitchen to his preferences, she agreed enthusiastically. When he commented that her hair looked prettier worn down, she immediately removed the pins that held it in place. Jakob noticed the changes with obvious satisfaction. At dinner, he complimented her improved attitude, speaking to her as if she were a favored pet learning new tricks. Sarah swallowed her revulsion and smiled gratefully, playing the role of a woman gradually accepting her place in his twisted world. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him as they cleared the dishes, "about some women lacking the strength for mountain living. I think I understand now what you meant." Jakob paused in his wiping of the dinner plates. "Oh, and what understanding have you reached?" Sarah chose her words carefully, drawing on everything she'd learned from Martha's diary and Jakob's own revealing comments. "I think some women fight against their nature instead of embracing it. They waste energy struggling against things they can't change, instead of finding happiness in acceptance." "Very wise," Jakob said approvingly. "Many women never learn that lesson. They exhaust themselves with futile resistance and make everyone around them miserable in the process." Over the following weeks, Sarah deepened her performance. She stopped asking about the outside world, stopped suggesting visits to town, stopped showing any interest in anything beyond the boundaries of Jakob's property. When he spoke, she listened with rapt attention. When he made decisions, she praised his wisdom. When he touched her, she responded with what appeared to be genuine affection. The transformation convinced Jakob so completely that he began leaving her alone for longer periods. He would spend entire days hunting or checking distant trap lines, secure in the knowledge that his wife had finally accepted her fate. These absences gave Sarah the opportunity she needed to continue her investigation and refine her escape plan. During one of Jakob's longer expeditions, Sarah made her most chilling discovery yet. While searching through a trunk in the root cellar, she found Martha's wedding dress, the same dress their mother had worn, passed down through 3 generations of Mitchell women. The white silk was perfectly preserved, carefully cleaned and pressed, stored between sheets of tissue paper like a religious relic. But it wasn't alone. Beside Martha's dress lay another wedding gown, this one in ivory satin with tiny pearl buttons that Sarah recognized from a description in Rebecca's letters. Her sister had saved for months to buy the fabric for her dream dress, had spent weeks sewing it by hand in preparation for a wedding that never came. And there were others. A dozen wedding dresses in various styles and conditions, each one representing a woman who had walked to the altar believing she'd found love and security. The collection was Jakob's private museum, his way of commemorating the moments when his victims had been most vulnerable, most trusting, most completely deceived. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined each dress, imagining the women who had worn them, the hopes and dreams that had died along with their owners. Some showed signs of violence, tears, stains, evidence of the struggles that had marked their owners' final moments. Others appeared untouched, suggesting their wearers had gone to their deaths, still believing in Jakob's promises of love. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oiled cloth, Sarah found Jakob's most treasured possessions, photographs of his victims in their wedding dresses. Professional portraits taken in town studios, showing radiant brides posing beside their grooms. Jakob appeared in several of the images, his face showing the same gentle expression that had fooled Sarah into trusting him. But the photographs told another story when viewed together. They revealed the scope of Jakob's operations, the systematic way he had preyed on vulnerable women across multiple territories. Some of the portraits were dated as far back as 1858. Meaning Jakob had been perfecting his methods for more than a decade. Sarah studied her husband's face in photograph after photograph, searching for some sign of the monster beneath the mask. But Jakob was a master of deception, showing only what his victims expected to see: devotion, kindness, the promise of security and love. No wonder so many women had fallen for his act. Sarah herself had been completely taken in until accident, and investigation had revealed the truth. As she replaced the photographs and closed the trunk, Sarah realized she was looking at evidence that could hang Jakob Stone. The photographs, combined with the ledger in the barn and the collection of personal effects, formed a comprehensive record of his crimes. But getting that evidence to the authorities would require escaping the mountain alive, and Jakob had made it clear that no one left his property without his permission. The solution came to Sarah during a sleepless night in late December. Jakob had mentioned that he made monthly supply runs to various towns throughout the territory, trading furs and preserved goods for necessities he couldn't produce on the mountain. His next trip was scheduled for early January, a journey that would take him away for nearly a week. Sarah began preparing for that opportunity with meticulous care. She secretly gathered supplies, food, warm clothing, the most damning pieces of evidence from Jakob's collection. She studied his maps and planned a route that would take her not to Cedar Falls, where Jakob might expect her to flee, but to Denver, where she could find federal marshals who wouldn't be swayed by local politics or Jakob's carefully constructed reputation. But first, she had to ensure Jakob suspected nothing. Sarah deepened her performance of submission, becoming so compliant and adoring that Jakob began treating her more like a treasured possession than a potential threat. He spoke freely in front of her about his plans and schedules, secure in his belief that she was completely broken to his will. The night before Jakob's departure, Sarah played her most crucial scene. As they prepared for bed, she clung to him with what appeared to be desperate affection. "I hate when you leave me," she whispered against his chest. "The silence feels so empty without your voice." Jakob stroked her hair with satisfaction. "You've learned to appreciate what you have, Sarah. That's the mark of true wisdom. Some women never understand how fortunate they are to be chosen, to be protected and cherished. Will you be gone long this time?" 5 days, perhaps 6 if the weather turns. "But you'll be safe here. The mountain protects what belongs to it." Sarah nodded against his shoulder, hiding her expression in the darkness. The mountain had indeed protected Jakob's property for years, hiding his crimes beneath blankets of snow and silence. But Sarah had learned something Jakob hadn't considered. Mountains could also conceal the movements of those determined to escape them. As Jakob settled into sleep, Sarah lay awake making final preparations. In a few hours, her husband would leave on his supply run, confident that his perfectly broken wife would be waiting for his return. Instead, he would find an empty cabin and the beginning of the end of his reign of terror. The wind outside carried the promise of storm, and Sarah smiled in the darkness. Weather that might delay Jakob's return would also cover her tracks and make pursuit more difficult. The mountain that had been his ally for so many years was about to become the instrument of his downfall. Rebecca's locket pressed against her heart, a reminder of all the women who hadn't lived to see this moment. Sarah would carry their memory with her down the mountain and into a world that needed to know the truth about Jakob Stone. The dead deserved justice, and Sarah was finally in a position to deliver it. Jakob left before dawn, on a Tuesday morning in early January, his wagon loaded with furs and his usual promises to return by Sunday. Sarah stood in the doorway waving goodbye, the picture of a devoted wife already missing her husband. The moment his wagon disappeared around the bend, she sprang into action. Her first priority was gathering the evidence that would damn Jakob. She collected the most incriminating photographs from the trunk, several pages from his murder ledger, and a selection of jewelry that might be traced to missing women. These she wrapped carefully and secured in a leather satchel that could be carried easily during her escape. But as Sarah prepared to leave the cabin that had been her prison, curiosity drove her to make one final search. Jakob's personal effects had always been off-limits. He kept his most private possessions in a locked wooden box beneath their bed. With time to spare and tools at hand, Sarah pried open the lock and discovered secrets that changed everything she thought she knew about her husband. At the top of the box lay official documents that made Sarah's blood run cold. A sheriff's badge from Leadville, Colorado. A warrant for the arrest of Deputy Jakob Stone, wanted for the rape and murder of 3 women while in custody. Newspaper clippings describing the manhunt for a corrupt lawman who had disappeared with evidence from several cases involving missing women. Sarah's hands shook as she read the articles. Jakob Stone wasn't just a serial killer. He was a former peace officer who had used his position of trust to prey on vulnerable women. The warrant was dated 1858, meaning he'd been a fugitive for more than 12 years. Hiding in the mountains while continuing to kill with the knowledge and experience he'd gained as a lawman. The articles painted a chilling picture of systematic abuse of power. Deputy Steinman had volunteered to transport female prisoners, handle cases involving missing persons, and investigate reports of violence against women. In each instance, he had used his access to victims and evidence to further his own twisted goals, covering his tracks with the very skills he'd been trained to use against criminals. But the most damning document was a letter in Jakob's own handwriting, apparently never sent, addressed to someone identified only as brother. The lawman's life served its purpose, but it became too dangerous to maintain. Too many questions about missing prisoners and misplaced evidence. The mountain provides better hunting grounds, isolated women desperate enough to trust a stranger, no witnesses to ask uncomfortable questions, and plenty of wilderness to hide mistakes. I've perfected the method you suggested. Marriage provides legal access and social camouflage, while the remote location ensures complete control. The specimens arrive willingly and disappear without investigation. Local authorities assume they've simply moved on. As frontier women often do, the collection grows steadily. 15 acquisitions to date, with an average lifespan of 4 months per specimen before disposal becomes necessary. I keep detailed records as you requested, documenting methods and results for future reference. Your advice about targeting family groups has proven especially effective. The Mitchell sisters provided excellent support, each one arriving voluntarily to investigate the previous disappearance. I anticipate similar success with other connected specimens. Sarah's vision blurred as the implications hit her. Jakob wasn't working alone. Somewhere out there was a brother, biological or otherwise, who was either committing similar crimes or facilitating Jakob's murders. The letter suggested a network of killers sharing information and techniques, treating women like hunting trophies to be collected and compared. The discovery changed everything about Sarah's escape plan. She wasn't just fleeing one murderer, but potentially exposing an entire conspiracy. The evidence in her possession could uncover crimes spanning multiple territories and save countless lives. But it also made her infinitely more dangerous to the people responsible. As Sarah prepared to close the box, her fingers found one final item that made her gasp with recognition. A small leather journal bound with ribbon, identical to the diary Martha had kept but written in an unfamiliar hand. The first entry was dated just 3 months earlier, October 15th, 1870, Brother J reports successful acquisition of final Mitchell specimen. Plans to maintain this one longer than previous subjects due to scarcity of suitable replacements in target area. Suggests 6-month timeline before disposal and relocation to fresh hunting grounds. Have forwarded intelligence on potential subjects in Wyoming territory. 3 unmarried sisters in Laramie show promise. Desperate enough to trust strangers, isolated enough to disappear without extensive investigation. Will coordinate timing to avoid overlap with current operation. The journal entries continued, documenting a systematic campaign of identifying, targeting, and disposing of vulnerable women across the Western Territories. Each entry was signed with initials, Brother M, and referenced communications with other conspirators identified only by letters. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of a network spanning multiple states, with dozens of victims and an unknown number of killers. But the final entry made Sarah's blood turn to ice. December 20th, 1870, Brother J. Reports Sarah Mitchell showing signs of complete submission. Plans to maintain specimen through spring for extended observation before disposal. Have identified replacement candidate in case early termination becomes necessary. Widow Emma Hartwell, neighboring property, shows interest in Brother J's welfare. Sarah's stomach lurched. Emma, the kind widow who had helped bury Jacob's supposed animal remains, was already marked as his next victim. The woman who had shown her friendship and sympathy was scheduled to die as soon as Jakob finished with Sarah. The revelation added desperate urgency to Sarah's escape plans. She wasn't just running for her own life anymore. She was racing to save Emma and expose a conspiracy that stretched far beyond one mountain madman. The evidence she carried could potentially save dozens of women, but only if she survived long enough to deliver it to authorities who couldn't be corrupted or intimidated. As Sarah gathered her supplies and prepared to leave the cabin, she made a crucial decision. Instead of heading directly to Denver as originally planned, she would stop at Emma's cabin first. She couldn't leave her friend to face Jakob's return without warning. Couldn't let another innocent woman become a victim of this monstrous conspiracy. The storm Jakob had predicted was building on the horizon. Dark clouds promising snow and wind that would make travel treacherous, but also help conceal her movements. Sarah took one last look at the cabin that had nearly become her tomb, then stepped into the wilderness, carrying evidence that could bring down a network of killers. But as she made her way through the forest toward Emma's distant cabin, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Had Jakob's departure been a ruse? Was he even now tracking her movements, allowing her to believe she was escaping while drawing her into an even deadlier trap? The wind through the pines sounded like whispered warnings, and every shadow could conceal a predator. Sarah clutched her satchel of evidence and pressed forward, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just her fate, but the lives of countless other women who didn't yet know they were being hunted by monsters wearing human faces. The mountain that had hidden so many secrets was about to give up its darkest truth. But only if Sarah could survive long enough to tell the world what she discovered in that locked box beneath a killer's bed. The journey to Emma's cabin should have taken 2 hours, but the storm was building faster than Sarah had anticipated. Snow began falling in earnest by mid-morning, and the wind howled through the pines with increasing ferocity. Sarah pulled her heavy cloak tighter and pressed forward, following the faint trail that connected the mountain homesteads. She was halfway to Emma's when she heard the sound that turned her blood to ice, the distant crack of a rifle, followed by Jakob's voice calling her name across the wilderness. He had returned early from his supply run, had discovered her absence, and was now hunting her like the animals he trapped for their pelts. Sarah abandoned the trail and plunged into the dense forest, hoping to lose herself among the towering pines and rocky outcroppings. But Jakob knew these mountains better than anyone, and his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the stone faces and carried by the wind until she couldn't tell which direction posed the greatest danger. "Sarah!" His voice boomed across the valley. I know you're out there. Come back to the cabin and we'll forget this foolishness. A mountain storm is no place for a woman alone. The false concern in his tone made Sarah's skin crawl. She could imagine him standing in their bedroom, studying the broken lock on his secret box, calculating exactly how much she'd learned and what it meant for his carefully constructed life. By now, he would know that she'd discovered his true identity, his connection to the conspiracy, his plans for Emma. The gentle husband mask would be completely gone, replaced by the cold efficiency of a predator protecting his territory. Sarah struggled through deepening snow, her breath coming in sharp puffs that steamed in the frigid air. The satchel of evidence banged against her hip with every step, its weight both burden and motivation. She had to reach Emma's cabin, had to warn her friend and get the evidence to authorities, no matter what the cost. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Jakob moved through the forest with practiced stealth, reading her tracks in the snow and anticipating her movements with the skill that had made him such an effective killer. Sarah realized with growing desperation that she couldn't outrun him, not in these conditions, and not on his home ground. The solution came to her as she passed a familiar landmark, the old mining claim where Martha had written about hiding supplies during her own failed escape attempts. According to the diary, Martha had cached food, warm clothing, and even weapons in an abandoned mine shaft, preparing for the escape she'd never lived to attempt. Sarah altered course toward the claim, praying that Martha's supplies had survived the intervening months. The mine entrance was nearly hidden by snow and fallen branches, but Sarah found the opening and squeezed inside. The tunnel stretched back into darkness, carved from living rock by miners who'd given up their claim when the ore played out. 50 feet into the mine, Sarah's fumbling hands found what Martha had left behind. A canvas bag contained dried food, extra clothing, and most importantly, a loaded shotgun with additional ammunition. Martha's final message was carved into the stone wall beside the cache. For whoever finds this, Jakob Stone is a murderer. Kill him before he kills you. Sarah checked the shotgun's action and loaded both barrels with trembling fingers. She'd learned to shoot as a girl, hunting small game with her father, but she'd never aimed a weapon at another human being. The thought of taking Jakob's life filled her with revulsion, but the memory of Pete's hanging body and all those unmarked graves steeled her resolve. Some men forfeited their right to live when they chose to prey on the innocent. The sound of footsteps crunching through snow announced Jakob's approach. Sarah extinguished her small lantern and pressed deeper into the mine, the shotgun heavy in her hands. She could hear him calling her name, his voice now carrying an edge of frustration and genuine anger. Sarah, stop this childish behavior. You're going to freeze to death out here, and for what? Some old papers and photographs that don't mean anything. Come back to the cabin and we'll discuss this like civilized people. But Sarah had read his ledger, had seen the clinical way he documented each murder. She knew exactly what discussing this like civilized people meant in Jakob's vocabulary. He would sweet-talk her into dropping her guard, then kill her with the same methodical efficiency he'd shown with all his other victims. The mine entrance darkened as Jakob's silhouette appeared against the storm. He held his rifle ready but not aimed, still playing the role of the concerned husband despite the obvious futility of the deception. In the grey light filtering through the falling snow, Sarah could see his face clearly for the first time since learning the truth about him. Gone was the gentle expression that had fooled her into trusting him. Jakob's features showed the cold calculation of a predator who'd been denied his prey, the barely controlled rage of a man whose carefully ordered world had been disrupted. This was the face Martha and Rebecca had seen in their final moments, not the loving husband, but the monster beneath the mask. I know you're in there. Sarah, Jakob said conversationally, stepping into the mine entrance. There's nowhere else to go. The storm is getting worse, and you'll never make it to town on foot. Come out now, and I promise your death will be quick and painless. Keep hiding, and I'll make it last for days. The casual way he spoke of her murder confirmed everything Sarah had learned from his records. To Jakob, she was already dead, just another specimen to be disposed of when her usefulness ended. The only variable was how much pain he would inflict before finishing the job. Sarah raised the shotgun and took careful aim. The mine tunnel would channel the blast and maximize the weapon's devastating power at close range. One shot would end Jakob's killing spree forever, would ensure that Emma and countless other women would never face the horror of becoming his victims. But as her finger tightened on the trigger, Sarah hesitated. Taking a human life, even in self-defense, was a line she'd never imagined crossing. The girl who'd been rejected by every suitor in Cedar Falls had never dreamed she would one day be crouched in a mine shaft, preparing to execute the man who'd promised to love and protect her. That moment of hesitation nearly cost Sarah her life. Jakob heard the subtle sound of her movement and dove sideways just as she fired. The shotgun blast thundered through the confined space, spraying rock chips and dust, but missing its target. Before Sarah could reload, Jakob was on his feet and charging deeper into the mine. "You little bitch," he snarled, his mask of civilization completely gone. "I should have killed you the first night, instead of wasting months breaking you in. But don't worry, I'll make sure you suffer for every day of trouble you've caused me." Sarah fumbled with the second barrel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the mechanism. Jakob's boots pounded against stone as he closed the distance between them, and she knew she had seconds before he reached her position. The shotgun clicked as the second barrel locked into place. Sarah spun around just as Jakob launched himself through the darkness, his hunting knife gleaming in his raised fist. She pulled the trigger without aiming, trusting to luck and the weapon's spread pattern to find its mark. The blast caught Jakob's center mass, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the mine wall. He slid to the ground with a wet, rattling sound, the knife clattering away into the darkness. But even mortally wounded, Jakob Stone wasn't finished yet. "You think you've won?" he gasped, blood frothing from his mouth. "There are others, dozens of others. The network. We'll find you. We'll make you pay." Sarah kept the empty shotgun trained on him as she backed toward the mine entrance. "The network is finished, Jakob. I have your records, your correspondence, everything. The law will hunt down every one of your brothers and see them hang." Jakob's laugh turned into a cough that sprayed blood across his chest. "You stupid little girl. You think we haven't planned for this? There are contingencies, ways to disappear, new identities, then they'll spend the rest of their lives running," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "And every woman they meet will know to fear men who make promises that sound too good to be true." As Jakob's breathing grew more labored, Sarah realized the immediate danger was passing. But the storm outside was intensifying, and she still had to reach Emma's cabin before Jakob's brothers discovered what had happened. The conspiracy he'd revealed was larger and more dangerous than anything she'd imagined, but that only made exposing it more urgent. Sarah gathered Martha's remaining supplies and stepped back into the blizzard, leaving Jakob Stone to die alone in the darkness he'd created. The evidence in her satchel would bring justice for all his victims and hopefully prevent future tragedies. But first, she had to survive the mountain storm and reach safety with the proof that would finally bring this network of killers into the light. Behind her, the mine entrance was already beginning to fill with snow, slowly burying the body of the man who had terrorized the mountains for more than a decade. The storm that had nearly killed Sarah would also provide Jakob Stone with the only grave he deserved, cold, dark, and forgotten by everyone except his victims. The storm had transformed the familiar mountain landscape into an alien wilderness. Snow fell so thick that Sarah could barely see 10 feet ahead, and the wind drove ice crystals into her face like needles. She stumbled through drifts that reached her knees, using the shotgun as a walking staff, while the satchel of evidence banged against her hip with every labored step. Emma's cabin should have been visible by now, but the whiteout conditions made navigation nearly impossible. Sarah stopped to get her bearings, studying the dim shapes of trees and rocks for anything that might indicate direction. The cold was already seeping through her layers of clothing, and she knew hypothermia would kill her long before she could reach safety if she became truly lost. A sound carried on the wind made her freeze, voices coming from the direction she'd been traveling. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Perhaps Emma had organized a search party, had somehow known that Sarah was in danger and needed help. But as the voices grew closer, Sarah realized they belonged to men she didn't recognize, and their words made her blood turn to ice. Trail leads this way, but the snow's covering it fast doesn't matter. She can't have gotten far in these conditions. Jakob's orders were clear. Find her and bring back the evidence. What we do with her after that is our choice. Sarah pressed herself against a massive pine tree, praying the storm would conceal her position. Jakob's brothers had arrived faster than she'd thought possible, and they were tracking her through the blizzard like a pack of wolves. How many were there? How had they found her trail so quickly? The answer came as the searchers passed closer to her hiding spot. She counted at least 4 distinct voices, and their equipment suggested they were experienced mountain men accustomed to hunting in harsh conditions. They carried lanterns that cut through the darkness, moved with practiced coordination, and spoke with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this kind of work before. "Check the mining claim," one voice ordered. If she found Martha's cache, she might have holed up there to wait out the storm. Already checked. Found Jakob's body, but no sign of the woman. She's still moving, probably heading for the Hartwell place. Sarah's heart hammered as she realized the implications. These men knew about Martha's cache, knew about Emma's cabin, knew details about Jakob's operation that suggested long-term involvement in the conspiracy. They weren't just searching for her, they were following a predetermined plan designed to contain any security breach. As the search party moved past her position, Sarah caught fragments of conversation that revealed the true scope of what she was. Fighting. Networks compromised if those documents. Reach federal marshals, 17. Active operations across 6 territories. Brother M says we might have to shut down and relocate everything. The numbers were staggering. 17 active operations meant 17 Jakob Stones scattered across the Western Territories, each one preying on vulnerable women with the support and coordination of this network. Sarah's discovery of the evidence hadn't just exposed one killer, she'd uncovered a conspiracy that spanned half the continent. Once the searchers passed, Sarah altered her course away from Emma's cabin. She couldn't lead these killers to her friend's door, couldn't risk Emma becoming another victim of the network's ruthless efficiency. Instead, she would have to find another way to reach civilization and get the evidence to authorities who could act on it. But the storm was worsening, and Sarah's strength was failing. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation with Jakob was fading, leaving her exhausted and increasingly vulnerable to the cold. Her feet were growing numb inside her boots, and ice was forming on her eyelashes and around the edges of her cloak. A sudden realization gave Sarah new direction and purpose. The old trapper's cabin, where Pete Garrison had lived, lay just 2 miles northeast of her current position. It would be stocked with supplies for winter survival, and more importantly, it was the last place the network would expect her to go. They would focus their search on more obvious destinations. Emma's cabin, the roads leading to town, the main mountain passes. Sarah struck out toward Pete's cabin, using her memory of his descriptions to navigate through the storm. The old man had talked about his home with the fondness of someone who'd spent decades perfecting its defenses against mountain winters. If she could reach it, she might be able to wait out both the storm and the immediate search, then make her way to civilization when conditions improved. The journey became a nightmare of endurance. Sarah's world narrowed to the next step, the next tree that offered momentary shelter, the next landmark that confirmed she was still moving in the right direction. The wind howled around her like the voices of all Jakob's victims, and more than once she stumbled and fell, face first, into the snow. But Rebecca's locket pressed against her heart, a constant reminder of why she couldn't give up. Every step brought her closer to justice for her sisters, closer to exposing the network that had killed so many innocent women. The evidence in her satchel represented the hopes and dreams of dozens of victims who would never see justice unless Sarah survived to deliver their stories to the world. After what felt like hours of struggle, Sarah finally saw the dim outline of Pete's cabin through the swirling snow. The small log structure sat in a clearing protected by tall pines, its chimney cold and dark against the grey sky. Sarah stumbled to the door on legs that barely supported her weight. Her hands so numb she could barely work the simple latch. The interior was exactly as Pete had left it, a Spartan but comfortable space equipped for a mountain man's solitary existence. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with preserved foods, ammunition, and the practical supplies needed to survive harsh winters. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with split wood stacked neatly beside it. Most importantly, the cabin was warm and dry, offering sanctuary from the killing storm outside. Sarah barred the door and immediately set about building a fire. Her hands shook so badly she could barely strike a match, but eventually flames caught in the kindling and began to spread to the larger logs. As warmth filled the small space, Sarah felt strength returning to her frozen limbs. She had just settled beside the fire to examine her precious evidence when a new sound cut through the storm, the distant baying of hounds. The network had brought tracking dogs, animals that could follow her scent trail even through the blizzard. Sarah's brief moment of safety was already evaporating. Moving quickly, Sarah searched Pete's supplies for anything that might help her survive what was coming. She found additional ammunition for the shotgun, a hunting knife with a razor-sharp blade, and several packets of black powder that Pete had used for blasting stumps. An idea began forming in her mind, desperate and dangerous, but perhaps her only chance of survival. The dog sounds were getting closer, accompanied now by the voices of the search party. Sarah could make out individual words carried on the wind, could hear the excitement in their tones as they realized they'd cornered their prey. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached the cabin. Working frantically, Sarah arranged the packets of black powder around the cabin's interior, creating a crude but effective explosive trap. If the network wanted their evidence back, they would have to come inside to get it. And when they did, Sarah would make sure they paid the ultimate price for their crimes. She left one packet of powder near the fireplace, with a long fuse leading to her position behind Pete's heavy oak table. The rest she distributed near the windows and door, anywhere the killers might try to force entry. It wasn't a sophisticated plan, but it would serve her purpose, ensuring that the evidence of the network's crimes survived, even if she didn't. The barking was much closer now, and Sarah could see the glow of lanterns through the windows. She checked the shotgun one final time, made sure the evidence satchel was secure, and prepared to make her final stand. After months of living in fear, of pretending submission while planning revenge, Sarah Mitchell Stone was ready to face her enemies on her own terms. A voice called out from the darkness, cultured and confident in a way that reminded Sarah unpleasantly of Jacob's false charm. "Mrs. Stone, we know you're in there. My name is Marcus Webb, and I represent certain business interests that your late husband may have mentioned. We'd like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding some property that belongs to us." Sarah almost laughed at the euphemism. Property meaning the lives and deaths of innocent women. Business interests meaning a conspiracy of murderers who saw human beings as commodities to be traded and disposed of. "The only arrangement I'm interested in," Sarah called back, "is seeing all of you hang for what you've done." There was a pause. Then Webb's voice returned with its false pleasantness replaced by cold menace. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Mrs. Stone. You possess certain documents that could cause considerable inconvenience to my associates. We're prepared to be generous in exchange for their return, a quick death, instead of the prolonged entertainment my men would prefer." Sarah's finger found the trigger of her shotgun. The network's arrogance was breathtaking. their certainty that they could intimidate her into submission just as they had terrorized so many other women. But they had made one crucial error. They had underestimated what a woman could accomplish when she had nothing left to lose. "Come and take them," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the storm. "But I promise, you'll pay a price that makes your business unprofitable." The attack came at dawn, just as the storm began to abate. Sarah had spent the night huddled behind Pete's overturned table, the shotgun across her knees and her finger never far from the fuse that would trigger her explosive trap. She dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound that might signal the killer's approach. The first sign of trouble was the cessation of the dogs barking. The hounds had been restless throughout the night, circling the cabin and whining at the scents they detected. But now they fell silent with an abruptness that spoke of trained discipline. Sarah knew the attack was imminent. Glass exploded inward as the cabin's single window shattered under the impact of a thrown rock. Before Sarah could react, a burning brand sailed through the opening, landing among Pete's supplies and immediately setting the dry goods ablaze. The message was clear. They meant to smoke her out or burn her alive. "Last chance, Mrs. Stone." Webb's voice called from outside. "Throw out the documents and we'll make this quick." Sarah's response was to light the fuse, leading to the nearest powder charge. The slow-burning cord began to sizzle and spark, giving her perhaps 2 minutes before the explosion would tear through the cabin's front wall. She had to time this perfectly. Too early and the killers would escape the blast. Too late, and she would be caught in her own trap. The cabin door splintered under the impact of an axe, then burst inward as 2 men rushed inside. Sarah recognized neither of them, but their movements spoke of professional training and ruthless experience. They moved like soldiers, covering each other's advance and sweeping the interior with practiced efficiency. Sarah waited until they were fully committed to entering the cabin, then triggered the first explosion. The blast shattered the front wall and filled the air with deadly splinters of wood and metal. One attacker was thrown backward through the ruined doorway, his body broken and still. The other managed to dive behind Pete's iron stove, but Sarah could see blood spreading across his shirt. "She's got explosives!" The wounded man shouted to his companions outside. "Fall back," and Sarah's shotgun blast cut off his warning. The range was point blank, and the heavy shot tore through his chest like a cannonball. He collapsed beside the stove, his rifle clattering away into the spreading flames. But the explosion had also set the cabin fully ablaze. Smoke filled the interior, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. Sarah grabbed her satchel of evidence and prepared to make a run for the back wall, where Pete's axe hung beside a pile of split logs. She never got the chance. The remaining window exploded inward as another attacker dove through the opening, landing in a roll that brought him up with a pistol in his hand. Sarah recognized him from one of Jakob's photographs, a thin man with pale eyes and the controlled movements of a professional killer. "Drop the weapon," he ordered, his gun trained on Sarah's chest. "Mr. Webb wants to talk to you before we finish this." Sarah kept the shotgun aimed at his center mass. At this range, both weapons would be instantly fatal. "Talk to me about what? How many more women you've killed? How many more families you've destroyed?" The man's smile was cold and empty. "You're thinking too small, Mrs. Stone. This operation spans 6 territories and involves some very important people. Politicians, judges, wealthy businessmen who appreciate our particular services. Your husband was just one asset in a much larger enterprise." "An enterprise that ends today," Sarah replied. "I'm afraid not. Even if you kill me, even if that evidence reaches the wrong people, we have contingencies. New identities, fresh territory, different methods. You might slow us down, but you can't stop what we've built." Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. "Maybe not. But I can sure as hell make it expensive for you to continue." The gunfight was brief and savage. Both weapons fired simultaneously, their reports merging into a thunderous roar that shook the burning cabin. Sarah felt the bullet tear through her shoulder, spinning her around and slamming her against the wall. But her shot had found its mark as well. The killer doubled over, his chest erupting in a spray of blood and bone, As he fell, his dying words carried a warning that chilled Sarah's blood. "Webb has your friend, the widow, Emma." They had taken Emma hostage to use as leverage against Sarah. The realization filled her with rage that burned hotter than the flames consuming Pete's cabin. These monsters had not only murdered her sisters and countless other women, now they were threatening the one person who had shown her kindness in this cursed place. Sarah staggered toward the back wall, her wounded shoulder screaming in protest with every movement. The cabin was becoming an inferno, and she had perhaps minutes before the remaining powder charges detonated in the heat. She grabbed Pete's axe and began hacking at the logs, trying to create an opening large enough to escape through. Wood chips flew as the blade bit into the seasoned timber. Sarah's shoulder wound made every swing agony, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Behind her, flames raced across the ceiling and down the walls, consuming everything Pete had built during his decades in the mountains. The wall finally gave way, just as the roof began to collapse. Sarah threw herself through the opening as burning timbers crashed down where she'd been standing moments before. She rolled in the snow, extinguishing the flames that had caught on her clothing, then struggled to her feet and looked around for signs of the remaining killers. The forest around Pete's cabin was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in pristine white that reflected the orange glow of the burning building. Sarah could see tracks in the snow, multiple sets leading away from the cabin toward the main trail, but no sign of living enemies. Webb and however many men he had left were gone, probably retreating to regroup after losing half their force to Sarah's desperate defense. But they had Emma, and that changed everything about Sarah's situation. She couldn't simply flee to the authorities now. Any attempt to expose the network would result in Emma's death. Sarah pressed her hand against her wounded shoulder, trying to stem the bleeding while she considered her options. The evidence in her satchel could still bring down the conspiracy, but only if she could rescue Emma first. And to do that, she would have to track professional killers through hostile terrain while wounded and exhausted. As Pete's cabin collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris, Sarah Mitchell Stone made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the frightened bride who had arrived on this mountain just months before. She would hunt the hunters, would track them to their lair and rescue Emma from their clutches. The network had taught her lessons in violence and survival that they would soon regret. The mountain had claimed many victims over the years, but it was about to witness the rise of a woman who refused to be counted among them. With Rebecca's locket pressed against her heart and Martha's courage flowing through her veins, Sarah set out to end this nightmare once and for all. 3 days after the burning of Pete's cabin, Sarah crouched in the forest, watching Webb's temporary camp through the grey light of dawn. Her wounded shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, and exhaustion weighed on her like a physical burden, but her resolve had never been stronger. She had tracked the killers to their hideout, an abandoned logging camp in a remote valley, and confirmed that Emma was alive but held captive in the main building. The camp showed signs of hasty occupation. Webb had brought at least 6 men, professional killers armed with rifles, and the cold efficiency that came from years of hunting human prey. But Sarah had spent the past 2 days learning their routines, studying their weaknesses, and preparing for a rescue that would either save Emma or kill them all. In her makeshift pack, Sarah carried the last of Pete's explosive powder along with everything she'd learned about her enemy's methods. The network's greatest strength, their systematic approach to violence, had become a weakness. When facing someone who understood their patterns and refused to be intimidated by their reputation, Sarah made her move during the guard's shift change, when attention was focused inward rather than on the surrounding forest. She slipped through the camp's perimeter and reached the main building undetected, her heart hammering as she peered through a gap in the chinked logs. Emma sat bound to a chair in the center of the room, her face bruised but her eyes alert and defiant. Webb paced nearby, clearly frustrated by the delay in his plans. 2 guards flanked the doorway, while others could be heard moving around the camp, preparing for what Sarah assumed would be another attempt to capture her. "Your friend is proving more resourceful than anticipated," Webb was saying to Emma. Jakob assured us she was completely broken, ready for disposal. "Instead, she's cost us 3 good men and compromised our entire Colorado operation." "Sarah's stronger than any of you realized," Emma replied, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "She'll see you all hang for what you've done." Webb's laugh was devoid of humor. "Even if she somehow reaches the authorities, which is highly unlikely given our resources, we have contingencies. New identities, fresh territory, influential friends who ensure our activities remain undisturbed. This network has survived for over a decade by planning for every possibility." Sarah had heard enough. She positioned the powder charge against the building's foundation, lit the fuse, and retreated to a safe distance. The explosion that followed shattered the morning calm and sent debris flying in all directions. The blast collapsed one wall of the main building and created the chaos Sarah needed to act. She charged through the smoke and dust, Pete's axe in her hands and Rebecca's locket burning against her heart. One guard was down, crushed by falling timbers. The other was stunned, but reaching for his rifle when Sarah's axe blade split his skull like cordwood. Webb had drawn his pistol and was aiming at Emma when Sarah tackled him from behind. They rolled across the floor, fighting for control of the weapon as Emma struggled against her bonds. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, but Webb managed to throw Sarah off and scrambled toward his rifle. Sarah was faster. Pete's hunting knife found its mark between Webb's shoulder blades, driving deep enough to pierce his heart. The network's representative collapsed with a look of surprised indignation, as if he couldn't believe a mere woman had bested him. The remaining killers were converging on the building, drawn by the explosion and gunshots. Sarah cut Emma's ropes and pressed Pete's spare pistol into her friend's hands. "Can you shoot?" Sarah asked. Emma's smile was grim. "My late husband taught me well. These bastards killed him when he got too curious about Jakob's activities." The final battle was brief but savage. The killers had expected to find a helpless victim, not 2 armed women fighting for their lives with nothing to lose. Sarah and Emma held the high ground inside the ruined building, picking off attackers as they tried to rush through the breach the explosion had created. When the shooting stopped, 5 men lay dead in the snow, their blood steaming in the cold morning air. Sarah and Emma emerged from the wreckage wounded but victorious, carrying evidence that would finally expose the network's crimes to the world. The journey to Denver took 2 weeks, complicated by Sarah's injuries and the need to avoid any of Webb's potential allies. But federal marshals proved more receptive than Sarah had dared hope. The documents from Jakob's collection, combined with Webb's correspondence found in the logging camp, provided evidence of a conspiracy that reached into multiple territories and implicated dozens of criminals. The trials that followed dominated newspapers across the Western territories. Sarah's testimony helped convict 17 men for crimes ranging from murder to conspiracy, while Emma's knowledge of local activities filled in details that prosecutors needed to build ironclad cases. The network that had terrorized women across 6 territories was finally brought to justice. Sarah returned to Cedar Falls, a changed woman. The frightened spinster who had accepted Jakob's proposal was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own strength and worth. She sold her parents' failing store and used the proceeds, along with the reward money from the federal government, to establish a refuge for women fleeing dangerous situations. Emma became her closest partner in this work, bringing her own experience of survival and loss to help others who had faced similar ordeals. Together, they created a network of their own, one dedicated to protecting rather than preying upon the vulnerable. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sit by her fireplace and hold Rebecca's locket, remembering the sisters who hadn't lived to see justice done. Their deaths had not been in vain. They had led Sarah to uncover crimes that might otherwise have continued for decades more. In saving herself, Sarah had saved countless other women who would never know how close they had come to sharing her sister's fate. The mountain where Jakob had hidden his secrets was now empty, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. But the graves behind his cabin had been opened, the victims identified where possible and given proper burial. Sarah attended every funeral, carrying flowers and the certainty that these women would finally be remembered, not as victims, but as the reason justice had finally come to the high country. Sometimes in dreams, Sarah returned to that burning cabin and relived the moments when she'd chosen to fight rather than submit. In those dreams, she could hear Martha's voice, encouraging her to be strong, could feel Rebecca's presence, lending her courage when hope seemed lost. The sisters were together again, united by bonds that death could not break and justice could not diminish. The mountain wind still howled through the pines, but it no longer carried the voices of the lost. Instead, it whispered stories of survival, of women who had found strength they didn't know they possessed, and of a network that had learned too late that some prey fight back with deadly consequences. Sarah's wedding ring from Jakob sat at the bottom of a mountain lake, where she had thrown it on the day the trials ended. In its place, she wore Emma's simple gold band, a symbol of chosen family and the bonds forged in shared struggle. Some marriages were built on lies and control, but the truest partnerships were founded on mutual respect and the courage to face whatever dangers the world might bring.